Hey everyone, welcome to our podcast episode today. I'm sharing sad news that my friend and mentor Dan Miller has passed away over the last couple of days. And many of the people I know Dan. Some of you probably don't. I wanted to spend this podcast episode just honoring this amazing man. He was a friend to me over the last few years. He was a mentor. I was in his mastermind. We did some work together. Dan is a best-selling author, a New York Times best-selling author of the book 48 Days to the Work You Love. He really helped people fulfill their dreams. He helped people move towards professionally, whether it was in a job or career or as an entrepreneur. He helped people move professionally into something they were passionate about, something that could present income, that could fulfill a dream. And Dan was just one of the most amazing men that I've known. I'm so grateful I got to meet him over the last few years. And one of the greatest compliments I received was when Dan hired a coach who he was working with to help him grow his audience in his Eagles community. And that coach suggested that he bring on a sales partner to support him in his monthly webinars. And a closer, they said, you need a closer. And Dan told me when he reached out that I was the only name he thought of. And I had an opportunity to work with him and his team and Ashley, his daughter, on their webinars for a few months in 2023, which was a special opportunity. And I loved watching Dan. I loved learning from Dan. I loved listening to Dan. He had a really special presence about him. And if you know him, you know he's just got this like calm, loving, generous, humble presence about him. He's just special. He's special. And the truth is, I thought I had more time. I thought I had more time to record this podcast episode before Dan passed. He reached out via email in December and shared of his diagnosis and that his time was limited. And I had an opportunity to respond back to that email and tell him how much I appreciate him and what I think of him. And I watched his friends and people I know in my network were sharing about him on Facebook and sharing their experiences and sharing stories and speaking their love and admiration of Dan while he was in his final weeks. And I had in my calendar multiple times a note to record this podcast episode and to publicly love on Dan a little bit while he was still with us. And the truth is, I never felt ready. Each week for several weeks in a row, as it came up to that time in my calendar that I was planning to record this podcast episode, I just couldn't do it. I felt unprepared for the grief. I felt like I didn't want to face it. I didn't want to face the reality or the truth that he had limited time left. And I think that my grief in missing Dan already, reminds me of my grief of missing my sister, losing my sister a couple of years ago, Linnea, who's, the greatest grief of my life. And I remember how heavy that experience was. And Dan and I have only been friends for a few years. And so the heaviness isn't the same, but it's a reminder of the challenges and the reality of life and death and the thoughts about heaven and the thoughts about God and how God does things and why God does things. And as each week I saw that note in my calendar to record the podcast episode about Dan, I thought, I'll do that next week. And I pushed it off a few times. And then he passed away just a couple of days ago. And so I didn't have a chance to record this podcast and for him to listen to it. But I do believe that Dan is in heaven, and I do believe that he knows how I feel about him. And I wanted to share this episode and just honor him. I know if you're listening to this, you're likely a Christian coach or a Christian entrepreneur. And I've received so many great lessons from Dan and the way he lived his life. He was such an impactful, amazing person. And I want to share 5 ideas, 5 lessons. Call it 4.8 lessons from Dan. Dan always true to his brand of 48 days, did things in 48s and 4.8s. When we worked together on his offer out of his webinar, he offered people a month at $4.80 for his Eagles community program. And we'll call it 4.8 ideas, 4.8 ideas, 4.8 lessons from Dan. The first is to put family and relationships first. My perception of Dan, the way I received him, was that he was just so loving to everyone. And he valued relationships way more than he valued business. And that's one of the reasons he was so successful in business. I also, though, recall how frequently when I talked to people about Dan or somebody brought Dan up to me, how they regularly shared that their favorite moments with Dan, their memory of Dan, is being with him and his wife Joanne at dinner at their house, and how they were welcomed in, and people just reflected on that more than anything he did in business. A wildly successful 7-figure business leader, a New York Times bestselling author, but what everyone thought about him was how wonderful it was to be welcomed into his home by him and Joanne, or to go out and share a meal with them at dinner. That was so important to them. And I think that that's how he lived his life, and I really value that. The second lesson from Dan is to be a humble, lifelong learner. I met Dan through Teresa McCloy, a good friend of mine, and Teresa introduced us. And then later, Teresa wrote her book, and Dan wrote the foreword of her book. And Teresa invited both Dan and I to her book launch party. And preceding her book launch party was a retreat, and she invited both of us to speak there. And so I got to speak with Dan at this book launch party. And I remember being in the back of the room listening to one of the other speakers, and I was sitting next to Dan, and Dan was scribbling notes. He was taking so many notes. And the truth is, I don't remember exactly who the speaker was, exactly what the topic was, but I didn't feel struck like, oh my gosh, I have to write this down right now. They were all great speakers, by the way, that weekend. Great speakers. But I remember looking over at him near the beginning of the person's message and not being struck that like something was just said that I need to write down, but seeing Dan, the most successful person in the room, one of the older gentlemen in the room, like who'd had more seasoning, more life experience than the speaker probably at front, taking the most notes, being the most attentive. It was incredible to see what a humble learner he was. And he could have been at that event thinking he knows it all, or expressing maybe even internally a view of self-importance, but he wasn't like that at all. He was the learner in the room. I want to be like Dan. I want to be a lifelong, humble learner. The third thing that I've learned from Dan is to be consistent. For roughly 20 years, could be a little bit more, could be a little bit less. But for roughly 20 years, I know Dan has released a podcast episode every single week. And he did so until just a few weeks ago. And for roughly 20 years, he released a email newsletter every single week, and he never missed. And I remember sitting with him on a picnic bench, having a meal, asking him about this. And it was one of the secrets, one of the keys to his success was just showing up consistently again and again and again and again. I asked him for tips when I was launching this podcast, the Sales Strategies for Christian Coaches podcast. And Dan said, just release an episode every single week, and 1 year from now, you'll be exactly where you want to be. He didn't have big, flashy secrets. He had consistency. And he knew that if you just showed up with the right heart, the right energy around things again and again and again, and you were dependable and consistent for your audience, that you would have success, that the following would grow, that the seed would develop into a thriving plant, a fruit later on. So be consistent. The fourth thing I want to learn from Dan is business related. Like I really learned from him the power of a membership community. His Eagles community just blew me away when he told me about it and all the people he had involved in it. And it was this low ticket, low price program, of course, $48 a month. And he had so many people involved in that program who were getting so much value from the network, the community, what he was providing. It was worth so much more. It was worth, at least in my opinion, 100 times more than what he was charging for it. And he was helping so many people through that community. And I was seeing the opportunity of like recurring revenue through that community and the opportunity to serve so many more people. And as somebody who's like come from a high ticket sales background, especially in the coaching space, the idea of a membership was something I initially scoffed at a little bit. I thought, man, no, the easier way, the better way is to have a high ticket program. And I do think for a lot of new coaches, beginning high ticket and then adding on a membership or a low ticket program later is the best and right strategy. But if it weren't for Dan, I don't know if I'd have a membership right now. And we just launched our Christian Coaches Academy membership earlier this month. We had 80 people join this membership, and I'm so excited about it. I'm so excited for the future of that program and that membership. And I learned that from Dan. I was inspired to start that program because of Dan. So I want to thank Dan for that. And I know all the people who are involved in our program and a community and loving it, you have Dan to thank. And the fifth lesson, or lesson number 4.8, is calm, faithful leadership. Dan just had this calm, faithful leadership presence about him. And his last podcast episode and the email he sent sharing the news of his diagnosis was just the same as his life. Calm, faithful leadership. It was beautiful. He was ready. He was ready to go to Jesus. And man, I admire that so much. And I hope that when my time comes, I can have that kind of calm, faithful leadership about me. He was that way until the very end. I want to close with this. Dan's program was called Eagles. He spoke about the eagle a lot. And I Googled eagle as I was preparing for this podcast and thinking about what I wanted to share about Dan. And I found a message that asked, or a question that asked, what does an eagle symbolize? And it said, eagles represent honesty, truth, majesty, strength, courage, wisdom, power, and freedom. As they roam the sky, they are believed to have a special connection to God. It's one of the first things I found. And this to me is Dan Miller. Dan represents honesty, truth, majesty, strength, courage, wisdom, power, and freedom. And as Dan roams the sky, he has a special connection to God. Dan, I love you. I thank you for being a mentor to me, for believing in me, for seeing me, for encouraging me, for being a great leader and a great friend. God bless you. Until we meet again.